Well, I'm really excited about my guest this week. Welcome, Sunflower Steve, to the Flower Podcast.
Hey, thank you, Scott. Nice to see you.
I
It's
guess you hear that a lot, don't you?
Yeah, and I do. Like I said earlier, for the record, I'm not a narcissist. I don't walk around calling myself, "Hi, I'm Sunflower Steve." I was nicknamed that by a friend of mine, and it kind of stuck. And in fact, when I was trying to figure out what to do with the seed company, I kind of put some feelers out. Do you think that's a good name? It sounds kind of hokey. And like, no, go with it. It really tells who you are and what you are, and you're a small time grower. You're not a big conglomeration, or whatever. So, Sunflower Steve stuck.
Well, and what you've been working on, you definitely have the notoriety with what you're doing,
Thank you.
which is what I'm really excited about getting into. I have to always ask my beginning question: how did you get into growing flowers, cut flowers, or just the floral industry?
Okay. I'll try to narrow it.
It's okay.
I was always into the native prairie plants, the native prairie grasses and prairie flowers. When we bought our property here back in the late 80s, early 90s, to better our property for the wildlife, and I discovered that a lot of the prairie plantings back then were mostly grass plantings. They were taking care of the animals, half the year, the cover time, but they weren't taking care of them when the chicks were around. So basically, if there's no flowers in your prairie, there's no insects. No insects, no protein. No protein. You don't have a diverse array of animals. So I really started researching the flowers that were native to my area here, and that was my first love of flowers. That being said, oh my gosh, my dad cursed every spring because he would put in marigolds and all salvia and all this stuff for my mom all the time. And I had no interest at all, but the prairie plants I really did. So moving forward, I think it was in 1999. Yeah, 1999. I was helping my father take a tree down, and at that time I was collecting Baptisia. I think they've changed it now, the name of it. Leucophia, which is the cream indigo. I was growing that for seed production for my place here, plus to sell some seed because I think it was $1,600 a pound at the time.
Wow.
At the same time, somebody had sent me some Baptisia australis, the blue one, and then after I planted them and
Right.
saw that they bloomed the same time, I thought, well, the one's going to cross pollinate the other one, and it's going to ruin the seed. I won't be able to sell any, my extra seed or whatever. So, um, I had fallen out of a tree, had broken some ribs. I was on the couch. I told my little girls at the
Oh
time,
gosh.
I said, "Can you guys go out and cut those blue flowers and just throw them on the ground? I don't want them pollinating the other, flowers." Well, they're little girls. They threw them in a vase and they put them on the mantle for me. And I always say because I was in a heightened state of awareness, being on Percocet, that I was looking up at them on the mantle, going, "They're so pretty." And then I had this epiphany that maybe I could make money off the flowers and the seeds. So long story short, I took him to a florist I went to as a kid, and kind of educated him on. He had never seen blue baptisia before. This is 1999, so this is quite a while ago.
Right.
And he said, "What else do you have?" So I brought him like golden Alexanders and rattlesnake master and like Penstemon digitalis, Penstemon grandiflorus, all these prairie flowers. And he was just like, "Whoa, whoa, whoa! I've never seen these before." So right there, I knew that I had a little something different. And one day I was getting my hair cut in our town. We have a little town of about 3,000. And I saw some coxcomb celosi up on the mantle where my hairdresser was cutting my hair. And I was like, "What is that?" And she told me. And then she said, "Well, my sister-in-law grows that for this big wholesaler over in the Twin Cities area. They buy tons of it from her." And I thought, well, geez, I wonder if they'd be interested in like my baptisia and stuff. So I got a phone number and I called and I called and I called and I called, and and I understood once I was there that in her office that she gets calls all the time with people trying to get in because they're so big. It's like landing the white elephant. So I literally just stopped over there with a bucket of golden Alexanders one day, and I walked up to I got a little bold. I walked up and said, "Can you tell Cindy that Steve is here?" And they're like, "Okay." I'm thinking, I hope she knows a Steve. I really hope she knows a Steve. And she came up, and lo and behold, she was like, I wasn't the Steve she was expecting, but she knew a Steve. So we had a little talk going, and she is literally the whole reason that I got into cut flowers and stayed in them. And God rest her soul, she passed away a few years ago. Without her taking a chance on a guy who knew nothing about flowers and educating her about the prairie flowers, I stayed in it long enough to discover the flower you want to talk about here, I assume, in a little bit. Had I not kept pursuing without her, I wouldn't have kept pursuing the cut flower business, which led me into where I am with my flower itself here. So, um, So that first year, I grew the same thing everybody else did. I grew zinnias, I grew lilies, I grew sunflowers, I grew all the staples. And I remember her saying, no, I didn't grow the zinnias at first. And I remember I was growing sunflowers, and she said, the second year, she says, well, can you grow zinnias for us? And I said, sure, what are they? And I had no idea. So, and kind of the way I was back then, I was still had a real job. I was still in advertising, but I was doing this kind of on the side. And then it's like zinnias. Okay, so I put in a half acre of zinnias, not having a clue about anything, and not realizing how much time and energy that was going to take. But I discovered, there was a market for local zinnias because they don't travel well. Again, this is back in 2000 now. So that was like my first full year at Cut Flowers was in 2000, and then it just kept going up from there. My wife and I started doing 2 different farmers markets with our kids, and I landed like 7 little floral shops as well as this one big one. And then in 2000, I think it was 2007, we had a farmers market where it rained so hard that nobody showed up. And here between the 2 markets, we had almost 200 bunches of flowers, and I was like, what are we going to do with these? So I drove to this big customer of mine, and she bought mostly single stems for their design department. Back in the heyday, the early 2000s, they had like 30 designers working for them. I mean, they were like FTD Central. Wow. Yeah, they're
right,
big.
right.
Well, in the meantime, they had bought out a place called Minneapolis Floral, which serviced a bunch of grocery stores, and so they had 56 different grocery stores they were supplying grab-and-go bouquets. And so I went with these farmers market bouquets, and I said, would you be interested in these? I know I've already made them. She's like, oh yeah, we have a whole other department that does that. I'm like, why didn't you tell me that years ago? So anyway, that buyer came out, and she looked at the bouquets, and the same thing that hit her was I had some native prairie flowers in there. I think there were a couple of the liatrices that aren't commonly known. I think it was Liatris aspera and Liatris ligostylus. And she's like, what are those? And I told her, and she's like, well, how many do you have? And I said, well, we have 200 bunches. And she said, well, I'll take them all. And I said, okay, how much are you going to pay me for them? And she goes, well, how much do you charge me? And to be honest with you, Scott, she offered me 50 cents more per bunch than I was getting at farmer's market. So I was like, wow. I remember it was the best day of my kid's life after doing farmers markets for that many years, which was great. I mean, they learned how to deal with people, how to make change, how to different type of personalities to deal with, to do actual sales. So it was a great experience for them. But as my 2 older ones started to reach like late middle school and early high school, their Friday nights were spent in the garage making bouquets instead of at the high school football game. So now I was like, hey guys, guess what? You can get all the bouquets done on Wednesday, and you don't have to do farmers markets on Saturday. You can go to football games and stuff on Friday night, and they were just like, yay! So anyway, we started making all the mixed bunches. We started making all the mixed bunches for that one customer, and through there, I met a wholesaler that supplied them and started making bunches for them as well. And like a lot of your listeners, I suppose that might be in the cut flower business, like farmers markets or on the farm type thing. After a while, sometimes when you're trying to manage that many different type of varieties of flowers, when you've got basically 25, 30 different plants, they all have their needs for bugs, they all have their needs for moisture, they all have their needs for powdery mildew, all the different things. And when your customer is expecting a bouquet that has 14 stems and 3 of them are this, and all of a sudden all your bells of Ireland are riddled with aphids, like, what do I do now? So you throw in some Gomfrey, and they're like, wait a second, that's not what I ordered. So my wife and I sat down in 2012 and decided, let's see what we can do high volume, huge turnaround in something that is really needed or wanted and desired for a market, but pretty easy to do. And we just settled on zinnias and sunflowers. And so over the last 10 years, especially the last 8, I would plant between 400 and 500,000 sunflowers every year for cut flowers. And that's way more than I need. And I learned that through a gentleman in California that, if you need 20,000 sunflowers a week guaranteed to hit your purchase orders, you better have 40,000 planted. Because you're gonna have bugs, you're gonna have powdery mildew, you're gonna have a storm that wipes you out. Make sure you have enough. And for a guy who always used to plant just what he needed, all of a sudden looking back at that field and seeing 6,000 or 7,000 flowers I could still sell, to leave it and go on to the next planting was kind of tough. But then I saw the brilliance of it. You're walking one step and getting a flower, me and the guys that work for me, versus having to walk 20 steps between flowers. It comes down to time is money. And all of my deliveries are an hour to an hour and a half away, so I spend so much time on the road making my deliveries. I can't afford to be spending that same amount of time walking between flowers. So so we really ramped it up and did mostly sunflowers and zinnias for our annuals. We have a big perennial push in the spring where we cut between 20 and 30,000 peonies every spring. And then we've got the snowball viburnums and usually between, depending on the year, 12 and 18,000 lilacs as well. I've got 9 different types of lilacs in for woody perennials. So I've got the hard woody perennials, then the summer ones come in, and then the only thing I really have hard in the fall now is the winterberry ilex. So,
Wow.
so
That's amazing.
that's kind of the cut flower story as far as where we went from, little stores and multiple mixed bunches to high volume, crank them out as fast as we can with 2 huge wholesalers and 1 big retailer.
Wow, that's incredible.
So,
It's interesting you share that because this summer, more than I ever have, I hear more and more, especially larger volume producers like yourself,
mm-hmm.
that have gone from growing 25, 30 different things to really focusing in on a handful of crops, a niche, exactly.
Yeah.
And what I think is fascinating too is the niche that you're focusing on. They're high value items. They're
mm-hmm.
not, the hydrangeas or the lilac. I think you said.
Yep.
Peony. I mean, those things are high volume items for sure. And I really appreciate you sharing the idea of overplanting because of the labor it saves you. I mean, I don't know how many times I hear people, sort of hesitate to buy certain seeds or to plant certain volumes because the seed's too expensive.
Mm-hmm.
And that is an issue, but at the same time, your labor is way more expensive often, I think, than the seed is.
If you can find it too, Scott, that's a huge thing is finding good labor.
Sure.
I've been blessed. At first, I had my cheap child labor, but as they aged out and wanted other things, and I never wanted them to hate the farm. If they had something else they wanted to do as more, that they wanted to do, I never held them back from doing their stuff. But they liked helping their dad around the farm. And then I got very fortunate. I went through a little while where my kids' friends wanted a job but didn't really want to work type of deal. But then I found a couple of their friends. My one daughter's friend in particular, 2 of her friends. One of them started working for me in 9th grade. The other one started working for me in 10th grade, and they worked for me for 7 years. And they would they to find 2 young guys like that had the work ethic they had. Not as much when they were in 9th and 10th grade because they're still squirrely little boys then, but. And I'll be honest with you, neither one of them had their actual father at home with them, so I don't know if I fit that thing a little bit with them. And for me, I have 4 daughters, so I kind of had 2 sons for 7 years.
Sure.
But it was really cool to watch these 2 guys grow, and I always told them, here's my process. If you find a process that is more efficient for you and it gets it done, I'm okay with that. And it was fun to watch these guys, grow and grow. So I guess my point was, it's hard to find good labor. And the first 7 years of doing this, I didn't have any labor. I kind of did it all with my kids and all that. And it was really hard to let the reins go, because if somebody that you have working for you screws something up, and that the quality control isn't there, and I just trust that it is, and all of a sudden it goes to my customer, and all of a sudden they're like, we have 100 bunches we're going to throw away because they've got bugs or whatever. I could lose my business. So I was like really anal at first about making sure everything was there. But as these guys were here longer, I trusted them. I mean, I would go make my deliveries, come back, and the flower fairy had filled up my cooler. I was like, this is so cool. But to have 2 guys like that, and then I was worried a couple of years ago. They both aged out, moved on with their lives, which I expected them to do. And then I got 2 new guys that were the same thing, and they were willing to work. Well, peonies, we start cutting peonies at 5 in the morning till about 9 in the morning, and then it's too hot to bunch, and then sometimes they're bunching in the cooler, till 1 in the morning and stuff. So the time frame to get people used to, like, okay, you're not going to work for a week here because it's between plants or whatever, but trust me, you'll get the hours next week. When you're working 18 hours a day for the next 5 days, you're going to be happy you had 3 days off and weren't making any money. So, so I guess back to the labor thing, that's a big issue on the farms. I know I've talked to other people. In fact, I just met a couple people this week at I can, and they're both younger. And one has been doing it for 10 years, but the only one's been doing it for 3 years. And I can see where they're, trying to say, God, this is just too much for me to do by myself. So finding good labor is really hard these days.
Yeah, sure is. I think it is for everybody, but I think in the kind of field, literally, you're in.
Yeah.
I think, yeah, I think it's especially difficult sometimes, especially when you're in smaller communities.
Yeah.
That's another part of it. There's not the population there to pull from.
Yeah.
And some people get it and some people don't. So that's
And to
fine.
be and to be
Well,
that. Yeah, I
yeah.
say, and to be that flexible to say, okay, yeah, for the next week, guys, we're not going to work, and then okay, tomorrow we're going to work till 3 in the morning. For them just to say okay, and I go, screw this, I'm going to McDonald's, you know. So
Absolutely. No,
yeah,
absolutely. So I didn't ask this earlier. I know that before we started, you're in Wisconsin. How
yes, sir.
much land do you have that you grow on?
Right now we have 60 acres. We had 100 acres, but most of that I rent out, and I've got some pasture and some woods too. But as far as like my woody perennials, all the lilacs and the viburnums, cranberry snowball viburnum, blue muffin viburnum, and all that, probably I've arranged somewhere about 6 or 7 acres now. It used to be 9, but I've eradicated some things to put in more sunflowers. Some of the ones that weren't making me any money or just weren't good, like the pink snowberry and the white snowberry. I mean, I had
Mm-hmm.
grew them for years and maybe got 1 or 2 crops off them. They get brown spots on them, and I could never figure it out. And it was like, after all that time and energy and money, I'm like, I know I can put sunflowers here and make money, so I eradicated them. So I think to answer your question, it's about 7 acres of woody perennials, and then my annuals, the sunflowers and the zinnias. That's changed as well too, because some of that's in seed production now. But anything I plant annually, probably close to 7 to 8 acres, maybe.
Wow, that's a
Somewhere in there.
lot. It's interesting. I know you've mentioned zinnias a couple times now.
Yep.
I know that a lot of times people have challenges around zinnias because sometimes they're not perceived with the same value as
Mm-hmm.
like a dahlia or a sunflower. Are all three of your main customers buying lots of zinnias? How many do you sell a week, if I can ask?
They were, well, I'll be honest with you, I didn't grow any this year or last year because I've been concentrating on the seed production.
Seed, right,
But prior to that,
right.
we would harvest, depending on the flush, but I would say an average of probably 3,000 a week. Um, and that was going to
Wow.
three different customers. We did a 7-stem, just straight zinnia bunch, like 3 of the darker, or 2 each of 3 of the darker colors, and usually a yellow color or a lime in there for a little pop for contrast. So it'd be a 7-stem bunch, and I know the first few years I grew 3 or 4 different. I grew Oklahoma and Benaries and Persian card. I after that first year I was like, the Benaries are where it's at. The Benaries Giants are where it's at, and they told me that. They're like, well, we'll take a few of these little ones, but we want as many of those big ones as we can get. So
Right.
I would have no trouble selling those in town because I'm only an hour away. A lot of times they got those flowers at 8 hours after they were cut. They don't really
Right.
like the cooler too much. Fortunately, I have 2 coolers. I can run one a little warmer than the other. But for the most part, they would condition in my barn in the shade. The guys that get them bunched, and I deliver them within 12 hours, so they wouldn't even hit the cooler.
Wow, that's incredible.
Yeah.
And was that mostly those assorted bunches? Are they mostly going into like like for bouquets, cash and carry situations, and like I mean, because the reason why I'm asking is because where I'm at currently, we were getting assorted bunches in, and then we switched to doing a combination of assorted and solid color.
Mm-hmm.
And we noticed our sales going up with the solid color, but I could see if they're more cash and carry, like a grocery store account, or they're just that kind of a thing where you're selling them as a finished product.
Yeah.
People might like to have the bright color.
Yeah, no, exactly. The one customer, she took about 500 a week, and hers was the mixed bunch, the mixed colors. But she has all the grocery stores, 62 grocery stores. So that's a grab and go bunch. Somebody comes in and I always say it looks like they're grabbing a bag of Skittles because they're already mixed up.
Yeah.
But the 2 big wholesalers, they wanted solids. They wanted a solid thing of purple, solid thing of red, solid thing of orange. So yeah, all the 2 big wholesalers, they wanted solid. And I only did
Okay.
7. I did 7 stem bunches because if you got more in that one sleeve, they push it on their heads. I would get a lot of broken necks. 7 was like the sweet spot.
Interesting.
5 looked too small in a bunch. 10 would break them. 7 was that perfect sweet spot.
Interesting. Yeah. Most of ours are in tens, which I prefer, but But I see your
Well,
point though, because
well, then
yeah,
your
you're
guys
right.
aren't
You
your
have
guys aren't
damage.
growing them big enough. Then mine were this big.
Okay, well, hopefully they're listening and they're going to take some notes.
Okay.
So that's awesome. Well, sunflowers. I know it's so interesting because I guess it was early last year or something where I saw, and I can't remember her name now. You mentioned her earlier.
Nicole Pitt
that
from
when
Flower
you
Hill Farm, New York.
Nicole,
Yeah.
yep. Yeah, I saw your interview on her YouTube channel,
Mm-hmm.
or her talking about you, and I was just like, okay, this is amazing. And when I saw the flowers, I was like, okay, so I started following you then, and I guess you're probably posting more now than you maybe did back then,
Yeah.
because I'm seeing your content popping up on my feeds,
Okay.
and that's where I learned you were growing all these other things. So before we get to sunflowers, I just have to ask this question.
Okay.
Where did the idea for the artwork come from? The
Okay.
field full of flowers, because that is, I mean, sometimes it's like, okay, that's really cool, but then sometimes I'm like, oh my gosh, the scale is huge.
I know. Well, they're the old saying of making lemonade out of lemons. Geez, I should have. I'm gonna see if you can see this picture on my phone. But last year, fortunately, it was the week after my daughter's wedding because I needed 1,000 sunflowers for her wedding. And the following week, I had, which is not too far off. I had a terrible storm. I don't know. Let's see if I don't know if you can see that. That's the wall cloud coming at my farm.
Oh my goodness! Yes, I
Yes.
see it. Looks
So
like a tsunami heading your way.
So I was making deliveries, and my guys were in the barn. And they said, "Hey, this is coming at us," and I went, "Oh, nothing good's going to come out of this." So I told them, "Go in the house, get in the basement, because that looks bad." And it was 70-mile-an-hour straight winds, like 3 inches of water with that wind. So basically, a brick wall coming down on everything. And it laid my last 3 plantings, about 150,000 sunflowers, laid them flat like a bulldozer rolled over them.
Oh my goodness!
So sunflowers, being what they'll do, they try to stand back up, and depending on how hard they get blown down, they can chase the sun. They can get relatively straight. But these were laying so flat down that when they stood up, 95% of the stem was only about 6 inches off the ground, and then the head turned up towards the sun. So in the past, I had done the old. Got on a ladder and put flowers on top of my picnic table, and did some little thing, writing with flowers, doing cute little things, right? And all of a sudden, I was looking at it, and I was like, "How often do you have 150,000 flowers to play with? Not very often." So we started going out and just cutting the heads.
Hopefully.
So we just hopefully we just started going out and cutting the heads off and filling up tubs, and it was kind of about that same time I was convinced. I have not been a social media guy. I actually stumbled into Nicole. Our whole relationship started from me stumbling into her YouTube thing, but I was not a Twitter guy, Instagram, Facebook, YouTube, anything. And after having a discussion, we can go into it later, but after having a discussion with Aaron from Floret and from Nicole, they're like, "You need to get on Instagram." And Aaron was the one that said, "You need to start a newsletter and start capturing these people from Instagram or whatever." So I told my daughter and her boyfriend. They had actually come down to help me cut flowers for like the next 3 weeks because my guys that worked for me had gone back to college. And my daughter wasn't starting a new job for a few weeks. So they came down, and then suddenly they had no flowers to cut. So I said, "Why don't you cut as many as you can there and go make me a giant smiley face, and we'll write, sign up for my newsletter with it." So they're like, "How big?" I'm like, "Well, let's cut all the flowers first." I'm like, "Okay, let's make it like 16 feet in diameter." So they actually did the math on that one. They made the circle, which was easy, putting a thing in the middle with a string to make the circle. But then they actually went on their emojis on their phone and measured how far down the eyeballs were or where the mouth was, so it looked in proportion or whatever. So that was the first one we did, was the sign up emoji of the big smiley face. And then it was just like, let's just get stupid fun with this stuff. And I would tell them to do stuff, and I would come back and go. They would exceed my expectations. We made this giant snowman. It was like 35 feet tall out of this was out of limelight hydrangeas that all had a bad side on them. Sometimes they get 3 sides on the hydrangeas. So no, it wasn't limelights. Those were the PGs. They almost always get 3-sided because they arch out. So they made this snowman for me, and then my daughter calls me up and said, "Dad, we made the snowman and we took the pictures with the drone. Can we do something else on them?" I said, "Knock yourself out." And I came back, and they had free-handed a 20-foot diameter snowflake out of them. I don't know if you've seen that one, but it's like,
I haven't.
I was like, oh my gosh, you guys, that's amazing. So then we just started thinking of more and more things, and kind of ran out of time. We did do a bunch. We made the Jesus fish, that you see people's cars. And then same thing, she called me up and said, Dad, we did the fish. Can we do something else? I said, sure. Well, they wound up taking that fish because they just did the outline of it and wrote Jesus in the middle. They took that outline, filled it in, and made a 25-foot long great white shark out of it. So, and people keep saying you should do a calendar, and I'm like, yeah, it's in the works, it's coming. So yeah, so that was the impetus, Scott. Was I had all those flowers, I had time, and I had let's do something fun with them. And so this year I actually overplanted each one of my plantings extra for doing sunflower art. And I did a contest a few weeks ago. I've done a couple contests for people to suggest things, and it's been fun. It's been really fun.
Well, I know, was it this week? I think you shared it was Top Gun or something like that with Maverick, and I was like, and of course you see it and you don't fully appreciate the scale of it, and then you lay down there in the field, and I'm like, oh my gosh, this thing is huge.
Yeah, from the tip of the jet to the bottom where it says Top Gun Maverick, that was like 27 feet. So it's thousands. We figured that took us 4 cubes, and we figured there was about 600. That was about 2,400 sunflowers at the minimum. So.
Wow. Yeah, at least you're finding a purpose for all those extra blooms you're planting as your insurance policy.
Yeah.
So and then that's really cool.
The lily one we did with the lilacs. Somebody's like, how can you afford it? Because we did a 16-foot lily out of lilacs they were Mount Baker, Pocahontas, and I can't remember 3 different lilacs. Well, they were the flowers that were on the branches too short I couldn't cut. So it actually was a benefit to take just the flower off because that branch will be longer next year. And we made this 16-foot lily out of lilacs, and that was the best smelling one. That one smelled even better than the peony one that we did.
Yeah, because was that one when you laid in the middle of or something like that?
I laid in the middle. I laid in the middle of the lily. Did you see the peony, the one, the unicorn we made?
Yes.
My little peony.
That was insane.
In typical testosterone fashion, did you see how we picked it up?
No.
My guys convinced me to run my lawnmower over it, make confetti out of it.
I did see that. That was the most pretty confetti I've ever seen before.
It was. And it broke down a lot quicker in the yard, and we didn't have to really pick it up. It didn't get slimy. We just ran it over several times, and it went right back into the soil. So
you just composted it. Yeah, we're live.
Hey, and you said something. You said something a second ago I wanted to touch on about insurance. When we talked about overplanting fields. Yeah. And I had several people say, how can you afford to not cut those flowers? And my statement to them was, for $200 I can get an extra 10,000 sunflowers in that planting. That's my insurance that I'm going to hit my purchase order. Because I don't think a lot of people understand that I've got so many flowers I have to deliver per week, and my customer doesn't care. If they get knocked down, they still want their 20,000 flowers. So for $200 per field that I plant, and I used to plant 12, this year I only did 10 because got the seed production. But for $200 per planting to make sure I have the extra flowers, that's pennies. I mean, that's peanuts.
Well, and that's the thing I was trying to hone in on too, because so often, I don't know. I think it's also when you get to a certain size, a certain scale, you understand that there is a much bigger picture at play here. Mm-hmm. And like you said, it's pennies when you're really looking at that scale. Yeah. So I want to talk about, we're going to get to Van Goghs here in a minute.
Okay.
But I want to talk about how you process sunflowers. I watched you harvesting and your process for that. Mm-hmm. And I have to admit, I was kind of surprised. Mm-hmm. And I thought it was brilliant. I mean, I thought it was great. Do you mind sharing kind of your process, just generally speaking, of course, because of time, of how you process sunflowers?
Sure. In the early days, I actually partnered up with Dos Gringos Sunflowers in 2012, and I had those big cubes that you've seen, those big plastic cubes with the grids on top, and we actually put those on a pallet, and then I had 6 inches of water in those and pulled those behind the four-wheeler. But once you had all that water and all those flowers, you're talking, 800, 900 pounds with the water and the flowers. So then when I get back to the barn, I had to pick it off at the tractor, put it on a pallet jack, drag it to the cooler, and we did that for about a week. And because that was my first time scaling up too. And then one of my daughters forgot to pick up probably, I don't know, 50 or 60 flowers. So they sat out there all day on the ground, cut. They weren't in the full sun, but they were out in, 75, 80-degree heat. And for whatever reason, I picked them up and brought them back to the barn, and they were all drooped over like a goose, with a broken neck. I chopped them, put them in water, did something. I came back in like 2 hours later, and they're all standing up, and I was like, you've got to be kidding me. Those things jump back up after being out there for a day? So I literally called a friend of mine he's a biologist. He's a fellow, the whole falconry thing's a whole other story. But we both train and hunt with birds of prey. But he's a biology teacher. So I called him up and said, how could this thing still, live like this? And he said, well, as long as all the vascular structure didn't dehydrate and they're still there, it'll do it to a point. And he's the one that convinced me. He said, well, what you should do is you should cut before the sun comes up. He said, because the flowers are in a state, I think he called it a state of torpor. They're basically sleeping. There's no sugars going up or down, so he said the vascular system within them can be slightly open up or down because in the heat of the day, you'll see a lot of heads drooping because they've taken all their nutrients and shot it down to the roots to relax for the day and not tax the plant. And as it cools down, it opens up and comes back up. So that's where I got the idea to start, cutting. At first, we were just cutting like, an hour before daylight. Well, then I started thinking, if we have everything cut before daylight, we have that many more extra hours in the day. Plus, that was also the brainchild of, like I think I told you earlier, we went through a lot of employees for a while. Is that one correct? Is this one correct? On judging what flower they could cut. So my job every morning, I get up, depending on the time of the year, 3 or 4 in the morning, and I go out with a headlamp on. And anything that needs to be cut for the day, I strip all the leaves off it. Save the top 2 leaves. I always leave the top 2 leaves on. Strip all the leaves off it. Well, then when they get here about an hour before sunrise and they have their headlamps on, they just look for flowers missing leaves and cut them. It's a no-brainer. They don't have to think about it. And it becomes highly efficient. So now we got all these flowers and, we put them in bunches laying on the ground. And so by the time the sun is just coming up, we're putting them in those cubes with the grids on it. I should have sent you a picture. I can send one to you later if you want to throw it in there when you.
Yeah.
Anyway, so we pick them up. We get them into the barn. We take them in there. Into the cooler. I've got a big 24 by 16 with a 10-foot tall cooler. Bring them in there to get all the field heat out of them. And then go get breakfast with the guys, come back, and they usually put UPC codes on the sleeves while we're waiting. And after a couple hours, then they bring them in the barn and start processing them. So I think if you cut them when they're not actively growing and get them in cold right away, that's one of the keys. And then when you actually do hydrate them, make sure they're in professional floral solution.
Okay.
So
then you recut them.
Yep,
and you recut and then put them in the solution. Okay.
Yep.
So how long does it usually take for them to cool down? Like how long are they dry before you do process them usually?
They're less than 3 hours.
Oh, okay. So it's not that long.
No, and it depends. Okay. And the thing is, if you're cutting a 38, 40-inch stem and you're cutting them off at 24 inches, the water, it never even got dry to the point where you're cutting them. They're slowly sucking up through that thing, especially in the cold. The difference between the cold and the heat is they're still degrading in the cold, but the cell structure isn't dehydrating. It's still there. In fact, that F14 you were talking about, when I had my guys for the last week here, we were cutting and throwing all those heads, just the heads, in those cubes, no water, whatever. Those things sat in my cooler, fully open, no stock on them, for 10 days before I made that jet. And and that jet looked like that the next morning because I ran out of daylight. I couldn't get the drone shot, so it sat there all night long, and I took it the next day. So, cold is the number one thing to preserve flowers. And I've told several people. In fact, the gal I saw on Thursday on my way home from Arkansas, I stopped in Northwest Illinois at a flower farm called Taylor & Co. And I walked in her barn and I saw her walk-in cooler. She's only doing it in her 3rd year. And I said, I'm so proud of you. And she goes, why? I said, I tell everybody that wants to get into cut flowers, get a cooler. I don't care if it's a refrigerator or a 4x6 or an old pop one or whatever. Get a cooler. It saves you so much time and your flowers look so much better. So, and I know Nicole just finally, after 3 years, put one in this year. So...
Yeah, it makes all the difference.
Yeah, so I don't know
I'm curious.
Did I answer your question on the processing, or did you?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, no, I think that's generally it. Because, I mean, I just know that sunflowers drink a lot of water. In
Mm-hmm.
fact, I know like when we're putting, we get them in boxes sometimes, and when we're cutting and putting them in, I always tell the guys, I'm like, listen, we really need to make sure there's a good amount of water in there because in a few days they can drink almost all of that water up. It's really amazing.
Yeah, and the thing is,
That's why I was so
no,
curious.
and the thing is, once the petals are open, they do drink an awful lot. But as they're opening up, they don't actually drink a ton. But once they're open, they really start drinking. And I know what you're talking about because when I did that little venture back in 2012 with Dos Gringos, we would cut the flowers at the same stage and wait till they got to the cup stage, and then we would bunch them, and then we would hydrate them for a day, and then we would just take the water. They'd be in the cooler with no water, and we could hold them for a week with no water. And
Yeah,
that's generally when you get them shipped, and you have to rehydrate them. So
right.
being that mine have never gone through the dehydration process at all, I've never seen an effect from it. Plus, like I said, once the petals are open and wide open, but I mean, you've seen ours. We cut them when they're like this.
Yeah.
By the time they go to my customers, it's almost at the cup stage, not quite. So.
Yeah, yeah. Interesting.
Mm-hmm.
So I've got to find out. I was having a conversation with somebody about your project,
Okay.
and I when I see the number of varieties that you are potentially working on at
Mm-hmm.
one time, how many different okay, I'm going to back up. I'm driving myself crazy doing this. I'm going to back up. So how did the world of your special sunflower kind of start? Why don't you tell us about
Okay.
that?
Well, first of all, the funny thing is, I wasn't called Sunflower Steve because of the Van Goghs. I was called just because of the thing we just talked about, the scale of flowers we talked about. So the
Growing
Van Goghs were a
thousands
whole
and
other.
thousands.
So so what happened was in 2007, I was idling one of my sunflower fields because it's the same thing. They drink water. They also suck a ton of nutrients out of the soil. And I hadn't amended the soils in 7 years. And I noticed every year the flowers got shorter and shorter, and the heads got smaller and smaller. So I put in some white clover in one of my old fields, and then in was that 2000? Yeah, 2007, 2008. I noticed there was a half a dozen, and I said this several times. I wished I'd have chronicled it, but I never knew I'd be here with the story.
Right.
So I know there was a handful of flowers that volunteered out in this field, and the year before, I know they were F1 hybrid sterile flowers. I don't remember if they were Sunrich, some Supremes, or Pro Cuts, or whatever. I just know they were sterile flowers. So in my brain, I was like, how can there even be a flower out here? Because all the seeds are sterile. There's no pollen on these flowers.
Sure.
And for the most part, some of them didn't even have a head. They had a stalk and got to a little bud that didn't even open up. And some of them were kind of gnarly looking. And then there was this one that looked like your typical teddy bear flower, but it had maroon down all the throats. And I was like, wow, that is really cool. And right, my brain I went to the University of Minnesota, and the colors are maroon and gold. And I went for my snippers, I was going to cut it, and I didn't have a snippers on me. Thank God. And
I know.
and then about 2 weeks later, I remember going by in the four-wheeler and thinking, oh, well, I'm going to cut that. And by then it was really looking ratty. And then I was like, well, I wonder if it has seed, because how can there be seed? All the reproductive parts are covered by petals. So even if there is pollen, how can it get down to the face? But I took the seed head anyway when it was dry, and I remember going through them one by one, squeezing air biscuit, air biscuit, air biscuit, air biscuit. Hey, there's a seed in there, and there was 12. I had 12 viable seeds out of the 572 seeds. There was 12 viable ones. So the next spring, I planted those in a flat. Actually, I almost forgot about them. I shouldn't say almost. I did forget about them. I put them in a baggie in the cupboard, and I got a call from Johnny's. That's back in the day when they actually used to call you. Everything wasn't the internet. You couldn't click. You couldn't click and buy back in 2008. And
Uh-huh.
they said something I had ordered was back ordered. Did I want something else? And so I went to grab my Johnny's catalog, and that bag fell out on the ground. And I was like, oh, God, oh yeah, those sunflowers. I should see if those grow. So long and short of it, I planted those 12. One looked like the original one, the maroon and gold, and the other one was this dark burgundy with a little lemon flecks in it. And I was like, that is really cool. And the other 10 were ugly stuff kids. So I collected those two, and for the first 3 years or so, I would get a bunch of seeds, but only like 2-3 dozen would have viable seeds in them. And then it was always the coolest looking ones had no viable seed. It was these ones that were kind of semi doubles, but they had a lot of pollen on them. And then I had this idea. There was a couple really cool ones with a lot of pollen on them, and some really cool ones that I thought probably didn't have pollen. So not knowing you're not supposed to move sunflowers, I just wet the ground down with some 5 gallon buckets. And then at night while they were sleeping, I dug a huge ball of dirt and I dug a hole by the other ones and I planted them right next to the other ones. In retrospect, I could have put them in a 5 gallon bucket and done the same thing, but actually planted them in the ground. So then in the next morning, when there's pollen on it, I just took the pollen and kept hitting the heads together and knocking as much pollen as I could into these double flowering ones. And then from there, they started going exponentially. And then there's a couple other little things I figured out about what was actually producing seed and what wasn't, and putting those closer together and culling out the ones I saw that weren't worth the real estate to keep there. And it just kind of kept going from there. And I think it was about 2012 or 13, I brought my first bunches to Kohler and Dram and showed them to my buyer. And he was like, those are great. He goes, can I get 200 of them? I'm like, I only have like 200 plants at home. So when he showed the interest, for me, I was like, yes, this is what I'm going to do. This is going to be my total thing against the competition in the Twin Cities. Nobody has this. Wasn't even thinking at all about any kind of seed production or anything. So that was the impetus. That's how I found it. That's how I kept kind of nudging along with that. But I was still full on in the cut flowers. This was kind of my side project. And somebody asked me that recently, like, well, how did you stay with this 15 years? That's determination. And I think it was more serendipity. This was my determination, was my cut flowers. That was my responsibility. This over here was my future thing to knock out my competition. So I think God just kept nudging me. He said, stay with this, stay with this. So I did. And so to your question of how many different types am I working on now? Too many. In 2016, I finally had a high percentage of doubles. I'd say somewhere about 90% of them are actually doubles or semi-doubles. And that year I actually shot video. We went through with ribbons, and anything that was similar looking in color, not the same, but similar, we flagged them all off. And that's in 2016 is when I started putting them in separate fields as far apart from each other as I could. And then going through and culling those every year to get rid of the singles and all things like that. And at that time, I think we were kind of working towards 6 kind of different colors. What I've found over the last few years is those lighter colors, the golds and the lemon colors, are really the ones that want to come out strong. Even in fields where I've taken like almost all fall colors, marked them, put them out there, these lemon colored and gold ones keep coming back out. So the teasing out the burgundies and the chocolates and the really dark colors has been more of a challenge. But the last 2 years I've kind of had a quantum leap. I've had some big jumps there. But the more the burgundy and gold and lemon and burgundy are the ones that are the dominant ones. They're all pretty, but it's just been harder to tease out the darker colors.
Well, it's interesting because so many times people don't realize that when you're breeding things, that there are certain genetics that just aren't as prolific or as strong, and of course those are always the ones we want, right?
Right.
But even still, some of the ones you have are just gorgeous. And anyway, I know I was sharing with somebody that just seeing the potential for what you are creating, I termed this really dramatically by saying, I honestly think that what you're working on now is probably one of the single biggest revolutionary projects.
Don't put this pressure on me.
Yeah. So, I mean, but seriously though, it's like leaps. I mean, it's like we see a lot of new sunflowers come out and a little bit of shading or different centers or some things like that. But I know that this is a process. This takes years. People don't appreciate the sweat equity and the time that goes into this process for any flower, much less something this special. Mm-hmm. So I know that I'm really excited to know that you did not have your snippers with you that day.
Me too.
And
yeah, it's funny. You hit on that. Actually, for the first time on my Instagram today, said something about, I was a little leery on putting a lot of the flowers up just from this year because people don't understand. A lot of those are one-offs. I mean, I've had hundreds and hundreds of one-offs where like, oh my gosh, this is amazing. Then you plant out all the progeny and there's not a single one that looks like it. And 50% of them reverted back to a single petal one and not even a pretty one. You're like, dang it. So when you finally get one, like the lemon drop one I'm working on, I've been working on trying to get one that's consistently a good double, and it hasn't worked until this last year. I had one called Big Bird, where I actually had 5 of hers look just like her. So now I'm hoping if even those 5 have 5, that's 25 more next year. So exponentially it goes up. So, and the other big one this year, which was the total super surprise for me. I was excited about it when I started working with it last year, but to get so many of that variegated one to come true this year was just mind-boggling. I mean, it blew me away. I had this flat, and I was told by a couple different people that sometimes that variegation skips several generations before it shows up again. And also it's hard to keep it because the plant threw in those colors there and says that's next year. Yeah, that's next year's problem. When next year comes by, it throws the right green in and it disappears. And I was told by a guy that has been working on stuff like this. He's like, it looks like the genes I have for the variegation, it's purposely putting that color there. It's not throwing it in by a default of just trying to complete the DNA strand to make the plant be viable. It's actually throwing those colors in there. And I did a couple, I'm not going to let you, it was a big teaser, I guess. I did a couple things this year with the pollen from that because this gentleman told me how to save the pollen and keep it and put it in the freezer. And I've got some viable seed of some plants that again, it was a, Hail Mary. I put the pollen from the variegated ones on and I'm like, oh my gosh, I know there's seeds and they're viable. That being said, when we talked about crossing things before, you could take, I'm going to make it simple, a red one and a white one, hoping to get a pink one. But you might just get the tallness of that plant or the shortness,
Right.
or whatever. And then the one good thing I found about having a variety in a mix, and that's kind of what Aaron had suggested doing the mix, is when you work towards an F1 hybrid to be all one monoculture, bloom within 60 to 65 days, the same color, same height, and all that, you give up other traits at the expense of that. You might give up the fact that early on maybe those plants had a disease resistance or were much stronger in a wind, you could set down better roots and all that. And that's what I found with these Van Goghs, that I have no disease problems whatsoever. I haven't had a single one get powdery mildew or downy mildew, which is a big problem in my area because we have such dewy mornings. I think I showed a video, I don't know if you saw that we wear full rain gear in the morning when we're...
Yes, I saw that.
It's so wet. And so we do have the mildew problems, and these Van Goghs have had none of that. And even some of the other issues of lodging because the roots don't go deep enough. The roots on these things they rival corn sometimes. So when you're trying to breed towards something, sometimes you give up. I mean, you can see in roses, you got this beautiful rose they bred, you go to smell it and there's nothing there. So
Right.
yeah, so it's been fun. I had this discussion with several people that 10 years ago I made a quantum leap and switched from the stuff we were doing to just the sunflowers and zinnias, mass bunches with all the perennials. And I feel like now I'm flipping a page again to get into breeding, and it's, you do something. It's been 22 years I've been doing this now. And you do something long enough and it gets to be passe or, kind of doesn't really light your fire anymore. And could I keep doing this? Could I keep growing more cut flowers and get bigger and bigger? And I could. But this whole breeding thing has really lit a fire. I mean, it's just cool to see things. And one thing that killed me was last year I was going through it. We call the fields every morning. When I say we, I mean me. Because I'm still I had this discussion with Aaron that what I see as a certain color in a certain planting, somebody else might see different. It's subjective. So when it comes to culling, I do it all because I want to make sure I'm working towards a certain thing. So all it takes is 3 or 4 flowers that somebody else thinks is the same color to have the bees cross that and you're back a year. But to just do this and create a new flower it's really lit a new fire in me, and it's cool. And the culls I was throwing on the ground, I had some people comment last year saying, why are you throwing that one on the ground? I'm like, well, it doesn't belong there. I'm like, well, I would buy that as a single. And I can't tell you how over the years a lot of ones I cut and I go, hey, that's really cool, but it's not a double. Now I'm like, I need to start actually come up with a single petal line of crazy colored ones.
Well, that's probably a whole lot easier.
Yeah, it is.
I know you keep mentioning Aaron, and so I know we're talking about Aaron Benzagine with Floret.
Yep.
So, what an opportunity to work with her and get her insight, because I know that she has a great eye for flowers and new potential flowers. I'm curious what she thought when she saw them for the first time.
Her literal words were, what can I do to help to bring this to market? It was nothing about, hey, I want to work with you, I want to make money. It was just like, what can I do to help you? And I was so appreciative of that because I was a cut flower guy. I mean, I knew nothing about seeds, and it's kind of a story how I even got in contact with her. But we talked several times, and I actually went out there and spoke with her a little bit, and she agreed to grow flowers for me and kind of trial them, and then just came upon the realization that we had a talk last summer, and she said, I think you should do this yourself. I think you should start your own seed company. I was like, wait, I do cut flowers. And she's like, no, this is where you're at now, Steve. You can do this. And so she's been a great mentor to me. Gives me advice. I bounce stuff off her. She's super busy, so
Right.
any kind of advice I can get from her, I take to heart. And there was also a gentleman at a rather large seed company that was been kind of my champion too, who's been giving me advice I throw about the variegated one. I threw some advice. He gave me advice on that one, and it's been really good to have these resources that prior to the internet and prior to social media, you never would have had. And that's my first 10 years in the cut flower business. I was just telling these guys yesterday, or a couple days ago at their farm, they're living in the golden age of information on this stuff. Mine was like,
Yeah.
well, that failed. Who can I ask about this? Nobody. Just do it differently next year and see if it works. So um, it is kind of exciting to see all these new flower farms popping up. I'm hoping that the market can bear that many people and it doesn't get in a big, you know, cost fight thing where people are coming and undercutting people just to get in the business, because I think the local flowers to actually demand a better price than anything that's imported.
Mm.
I had that several times early on with one of my big customers. Somebody would come in, they'd come in like super cheap. I'd lose business for the second half of the summer on the, part. They would never get rid of me, but they'd say, we're going to get half our zinnias from them and half from you because they're like 40 cents a stem cheaper. I'm like, well, they'll be out of business next year. And they were. So I hope with all the new people popping up and hitting the markets and all that, that everybody sees a value in what they do and doesn't undercut their own throats just to try to get the business. Because in the long run, it's not
Right.
going to, you can't, it's hard to go up on your price. You can always come down, but it's
Yeah.
really, really hard to go up. And once you're in there, everything else is going to go up. Your cost of fuel this year, especially cost of labor, everything's going to keep going up. So if you start here, you're working behind the eight ball.
Right. From the very beginning.
Right.
From the very beginning.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, that's crazy. I know I was really thrilled to see you sort of. I got on your mailing list and I noticed that you did sort of a introductory seed release, a
Yep.
fundraiser.
Yep.
And I'd love to hear more about that and how did that go and what kind of seed did you actually end up selling for that?
Okay, so last year, like this year, I had a huge storm that wiped a bunch of my production out. And so I was kind of ready to still go with a seed sale, but I talked to my one guy at the big seed company. He's like, no, you need more. And Aaron concurred, and I was like, dang it. So the backstory to this is, and this is separate from the flowers, but they actually are intertwined at the end, that my wife and I in 2019, at the behest of our daughters, came to us and told us that the Christian youth summer camp they had gone to as kids in the northern woods of Wisconsin, the pastor that owned it was taking a job at another state and he was selling it and it was closing down forever. And I was like, oh, I'm sorry, girls, that's too bad. I know you love going there. My wife took all the kids from our youth group there, and when I said that, they said, we need to buy it and save it. and I said, no, we don't.
Wow.
I said, no, we
That
don't.
was not subtle.
No, and
Uh-huh.
I said, it's not on my bucket list to go into debt at this stage of my life. And long and short of it, we decided it was the right thing to do. And so we bought the camp and our kids ran it. And 2019 was good. And I saw the potential for it. And my wife and I had kind of talked about maybe doing mission trips when we were older, but what a better mission than to have a nice place in the northern woods of Wisconsin where hundreds and hundreds of kids can come every summer and get closer to God and do all the activities they do with the canoeing, kayaking, high ropes, and all that stuff. So we bought it and it was great. And then 2020 hit, and everybody knows what happened in
Yeah.
2020. It's hard to have a camp when you don't have campers. So we struggled through that first year and were able to keep it afloat. And then I decided last spring or last fall, I saw a couple of YouTube channels. There was a couple of gals on there. They did more homesteading, but I think the reason they came up in the queue for me was they were showing flowers at the time. So I clicked on it, and both of them were very strong in their faith. So I reached out to the one gal, Jessica from Roots and Refuge, and she had like 500,000 YouTubers. And I thought, well, there's no way in heck she's going to see my Instagram. I think I had like 2,000 followers at the time, and I honestly think it was 20 minutes later. She texted me back, Sunflower Steve, I know all about you. I'm like, no flipping way. How does that happen? And I called, we got in touch with each other, and I said, I've got this flower. She goes, I know, I've seen it. I said, well, I have an idea. I can't sell my seeds next year because I don't have enough. So I kind of want to do a legacy fundraiser sale to try to keep our camp alive, also get exposure for my seeds and see if we can combine the two things together, because I truly feel like God put this flower in front of me to, to help me keep our camp viable. So my idea was I was going to do a limited sale of 1,000 packets of seeds at a pretty good price, $100 a piece. And I know that's not for everybody, and I priced a lot of people out of it. But the mission that was behind it was, if they were to buy these seeds from me, it's a 2-for-1. I'd send them a second pack this year, which I'm going to do as well. And if we hit our goal, my wife and I had to log some property off up there to raise money for funds up there. So we had about a 6-acre clear cut there that I said, if we hit our goal, I will plant 1,000 trees in that clear cut, and we'll call it the Legacy Forest. So when I'm no longer here, my grandkids are walking around the forest 50 years from now, and they can tell other people, the whole reason this forest here and this camp is here is because there's people who saw it in their heart to help us out and bought my grandfather's seeds, and then the campers planted this forest. Well, it went fantastic. I went on her podcast, and it was overwhelming. We did super well. So much so I said, we're going to plant 2,000 trees. So this summer, the campers were up there, and they thought it was great too. So they planted 2,000 trees in this area, and it'll be fun to watch it grow over the next 25, 30 years and see the Legacy Forest grow right before my eyes, and know that the reason that that's there and our camp is still viable is because of this little flower I found 15 years ago.
Wow, that's incredible.
Thanks.
Well, that's really something. I know when I saw that, I was so frustrated because I wanted to get seed, and I thought to myself, we're renting a house right now in Nashville, so I can't even plant in the yard because of the agreement that I have.
Right.
So I'm like, it's really hard for the horticulturist in me to live here right now. But I was excited, and I need to reach out to Kara Jamison because I saw she got some of your seed.
Yep.
And she had planted some, and I've seen them on her feed, which were wonderful. And so when you were selling those packages of seeds, they were assorted, right? They're just sort of a mix.
Yeah, it's a mix. It's and so what I do now is I take the mix, and I have one whole field I plant out in a huge mix. Then I have my other fields where I have them isolated, and what I do, I have them isolated in 2 ways. One is they're a half mile apart from each other. The production fields all have different beehives, so they're not going as far, so I'm hoping to mitigate the cross-pollination. And then I will plant most of the dark colors on one side of the farm and the lighter ones on the other side of the farm. So if there is a little cross-pollination, it's not going to be noticeable. And within those, I plant like 3 weeks apart. So as like the Marleys, which is a maroon and lemon one, as those ones are petering out and almost getting done and been culling, as soon as I see the one I'm calling Burgundy Flex, as soon as I see that one start to bloom, everything in the Marley field I go and cut down. So the other way to mitigate the cross-pollination is just planting at 3 weeks apart, separate time. So I've got distance and time separating the genetics. Apart from that, on a whole other part of the farm, I've got a big field that I call the mixed planting. And that's where the mixed flowers come from. It's every genetic I've ever had is in that field. And so in that field, I'm looking for all my new one-offs. You mix that many different genetics, you wind up getting these. I mean, the flowers, well, you saw some of them this year. They're just amazingly cool. And so I bag those off, I hand pollinate them, I grab the seed, and then I plant them out when I call my propagation field the next year. And again, like we talked earlier, that's to see if they reproduce and are they scalable. And so far at this point, it's probably 50 to 1. 50 cool ones, you wind up getting one, you can start to scale up. So the mixed field, that was my idea, was I'm going to bag off everything that's cool. Those will be my one-offs. That's going to be hopefully some of my new varieties. And everything that's left over in that field, I will clean down and sell as a mix. And the thing about that is you'll get doubles, you'll get semi-doubles, and you'll get singles. They're all going to be cool. And my worry when I first sold them was, well, people see the really cool double ones and they don't get very many. Are they going to be upset? And I tell you, some of the first ones to bloom that I was getting pictures on my Instagram, they're like, this is so beautiful. I'm thinking, it's not even a double when they're flipping out over it. It was like a really super cool single petaled one. And it was like, okay. And then I started getting pictures of the doubles and things like that. And then I said, it was going to be approximately 50 seeds. Well, I was so worried about not having good germination. And I did the best job I could. I cleaned the seed here best I could. And then I took them to some friends of mine. I don't know if you're familiar with Prairie Moon Nursery out of Winona, Minnesota.
Yeah.
Nothing but prairie plants. They've been around for like 35 years. They're like the leader in prairie plants. I went down and used their seed cleaning equipment to get it even cleaner. And I was like, okay, I'm going to overpack everybody. So I think everybody probably got closer to 75 seeds because I was so worried about people having a bad experience because they paid a fair amount of money, but it was for a good cause.
Yeah.
So yeah, so way back to your question was yes, it was a mix, and it was a mix of colors, shapes, and sizes.
Wow. How incredible. So, what is the next opportunity people have for getting your seeds?
So next spring, 2023, I will launch a Van Gogh's Fantasy Mix again, and it'll be just like the mix that I sold last time. Again, it'll be lighter. The percentage will probably be more of the lighter flowers, the lemon and maroons, and the maroon with lemon, and a few darker ones here for the mix probably for the next couple of years. And so I start to tease out more of those dark colors. But there will be a sale probably February or March. Um, I don't know on what scale at this point. We were talking earlier that I've suffered again some storm damage.
Yeah.
It's amazing how some fields didn't get touched. The Marley field didn't get touched, but that one's not going to be ready for 2 years. But my mixed field got hit pretty darn hard. So
Mm-hmm.
there'll be seeds there. I shouldn't say limited because I have no idea. I've got like 26,000 IG followers. I have 13,000 people on my mailing list, but I don't know how many of those are from out of this country. I don't know if people buy 2 packets. They aren't going to be as much, obviously. But I'll probably ask a little more for them because literally I'm the only place in the world you can get them. And
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
and as you know, anything open pollinated within minimum 3, probably maximum 5 years, I'll be competing against myself. Somebody else is going to take the seeds, repackage them, call them something else. So suddenly I'll be competing against myself. Hopefully by then I'll have a bunch of new ones coming along down the line. I have some cool ones this year that I'm very optimistic about what they might be next year. Sorry to be so vague. I would love to show you pictures, but I don't want to. I don't want to set the bar so high that it doesn't get met. Um, I'm also this is a first time thing here too. This is an exclusive for Scott. Um,
Yay.
I'll probably be doing another type of fundraising sale. It'll be explained in my newsletter, but I might be doing a limited release of the lemon drops. That one is really, really, really close to being stable. I would say 98% of the flowers in that field were that full blown lemon color, and 90% of them were doubles or semi doubles.
Wow.
But it's going to be a sale where I do some seeds and maybe some of my. I'm going to be coming out with merchandise.
Merch? Did
Merch.
you get some merch? I saw
I,
your
I,
merch.
I like
Yeah.
to call it. I'm differentiating myself. I'm calling them wearables.
Wearables.
Sunflower
Okay.
Steve. Sunflower wearable. So
I
so
love that.
we'll be
Wearable sunflowers.
yeah, we'll be doing some sort of little thing. Not exactly the full parameters of it, but probably that'll be probably before Christmas. So a good time to buy somebody a Christmas present. So
There you go.
and I know a guy, so you might be able to get some, even though it's not your place you're living at. You might get some seeds to your house too if your address makes it onto my phone. So,
Okay. Well, that could happen. So,
yeah.
I mean, if you could have a random sunflower in a field, I'm sure that could happen too.
Yeah.
Well, I know this. I would probably buy me some big pots and put them in at least and try that. It's amazing. Well, Steve, I always like to wrap up our episodes with this advice question.
Okay.
And it can be something that's either meant a lot to you or something you'd like to pass on to our listeners, just from your own experience and your own time growing flowers.
Okay. Um, the cut flower business. Several things for newbies. Like I said before, get yourself some way to cool the flowers down. I mean, if you're going to take it serious, a cooler, a refrigerator, a cool bot, people making things like that. Try to find somebody in your area that is growing kind of the stuff you want to grow. Because I get questions all the time about growing things, and I'm like, my conditions are so different than even people that live 10 miles away from me. But try to find out what
Right.
grows. Try to find out what grows best in your area. Had I known that those snowberries wouldn't have grown that well here, I wouldn't have planted them. That was 200 shrubs I basically grew for like 7 years. Never hardly got a crop off them and turned them back into the ground. So, if you can find a resource in your area and somebody's willing to at least let you know, or maybe you don't even ask them. Find if there's a flower farm around and go see what they're growing, and you'll tell right away if they got stuff that doesn't look good. It probably won't look good at your place either. So, I would say for the cut flower grower, get something to cool them down in. Find out what grows best in your area. Another piece of advice is have a spouse that has a good job. No, be prepared for setbacks because they happen, and be able to. And this is coming from me. I wasn't prepared, and I didn't take them very well in the beginning. When I had a storm, I mean, you could hear me out there in the middle of the night with a headlamp on, seeing all my stuff laid down. And my neighbors could hear me. We live out in the country because I wasn't very happy about it. But at a certain point, you got to realize there's only so much you can control, and be prepared for that. And how are you going to pivot from that? You know, are you going to make these giant sunflower murals that are 50 feet in diameter, or just know that there's going to be pitfalls, and I know it's probably easy to say, it's much harder to deal with, but they do happen, and especially once you start scaling up, the problems get bigger, the diseases get bigger, the bugs get bigger. So if you decide to scale up, be prepared. Be prepared for bigger problems. I'm not trying to make it be a downer. I'm just saying be prepared for it. It's been a great business for me. I was in advertising and sales before I got into this. And you were always trying to outcompete the competition, and there was a lot of lying going on and stuff like that. And I remember after making my first sale of flowers and coming back, and I told my wife, I said, you know what? Everybody's always happy to see me. They're never, I mean, to go there with something and people be so overjoyed to see you with fresh flowers, it was so different than the business I was in. So it is a great business to be in. It does give you joy. And it does make it worth all the mosquito bites and the back-breaking stuff and all the stuff that goes along with it. So anyway, I hope that's a little bit of advice.
I think that's great.
Okay.
Well, thank you, Steve, so much for being on the Flower Podcast.
You're welcome, Scott. Sorry it took so long, but I've been cutting flowers, so.